Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the session today, the Future of Euro-MENA Relations. I would like to introduce to the floor Ambassador Phil Rieker, who is the chair of the Global Europe Program and partner and practice lead of Europe and Eurasia at Albright Stonebridge Group. So, Ambassador Rieker, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Yusuf. It's always good to be back here in the auditorium, and we've been looking forward to today's events for quite some time. It's an extremely timely seminar and conference that we're here to introduce. So I'm pleased to welcome dear ambassadors and embassy representatives, including my friend Francesco Meucci from the Embassy of Italy, other distinguished guests with us. On behalf of the Wilson Center's President and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, and especially from the Wilson's Global Europe and Middle East programs, I really want to welcome everyone here today for this conference on the future of Europe and MENA. Now, we all say MENA, but I think sometimes outside this bubble in Washington, we get caught up in our abbreviations. So MENA, of course, is the short term for the Middle East and North Africa. And the relations between Europe and the Middle East and North Africa are critical because, as I've often said about diplomacy, geography matters. It's easy to forget that in today's interconnected and digital world, but we live on and share this one Earth, this globe, and the geography and all that comes with that does matter. Europe and the MENA region share strong political, historical, security, and economic ties. And yet, as it has over the centuries, the interregional landscape is undergoing a significant transformation due to shifting geopolitical dynamics, including, of course, demographics and climate. You just look at today's headlines, and the broader region is very much in focus. But that focus itself is sometimes blurry, and that's why we have this opportunity today to discuss some of the challenges that have dominated and continue to dominate our headlines, including ongoing military conflicts in Gaza, in Sudan, Ukraine, mass migration, environmental challenges, understanding their evolving relationships between these two geographic regions and the opportunities for cooperation is more crucial than ever. Now, today's conference, as I alluded, concludes a year-long project focused on the evolving relationship between Europe and the Middle East North Africa region. Here at Wilson, we are uniquely positioned to facilitate this dialogue. As we say proudly, we are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan, which is tough these days in Washington, across the country, and frankly around the globe. Nonpartisan. And over the past year, we've been bringing together policymakers, scholars, practitioners, diplomats from the Middle East and North Africa, from Europe and from the United States, to discuss ongoing challenges and to develop a framework for productive engagement on issues like migration, trade, and energy security. Both of these regions are integral to U.S. national security interests. You can see that from the headlines and the discussions that dominate our foreign policy agenda. Their interactions and cooperation impact the United States and our foreign policy objectives, as well as those of countries across both regions. We're therefore pleased to present cutting-edge research from six scholars on critical issues shaping the relations between Europe and the MENA region. From trade and economic cooperation, as I mentioned, to energy transition, collective action on migration, and the European Union's role in supporting democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, and we should note supporting democracy on the Europe side of the Mediterranean too. And Mediterranean is a crucial word and geographic indicator as part of this discussion. Now, this edited volume, which looks so much better as something you can hold than it does in digits on the screen, It provides a really innovative policy recommendation set for both regions to harness the opportunities and to create productive synergies. And that's very much what we're about here at the Wilson Center, finding synergies. It also demonstrates the important relationship between scholarship and policy, which the Wilson Center, of course, exemplifies. The future of Euro-MENA relations hinges not only on addressing the immediate crises, but also on building the long-term, mutually beneficial partnerships that are so crucial for security, stability, and prosperity. The results of this project show the potential and the benefits of such research for how we can better navigate the challenges and seize opportunities that lie ahead. So, dear guests, in closing, I want to extend my gratitude and congratulations to Yusuf Khan and to Masha Ochberg for leading the Future of Europe and MENA project, and of course to our colleague Merissa Khurma and to Robin Quinville, the directors respectively of the Middle East and Global Europe programs, for their guidance, and to the rest of the Middle East and Global Europe teams here at the Wilson Center. They brought this conference to life. We're delighted to have a group with us today and to follow this up. Our appreciation goes to all 6 of the fellows for their excellent work. Of course, to President Ambassador Mark Green for his leadership and support, and to the government of the state of Qatar for the partnership and support for this project. We really owe them our thanks and are very grateful for their interest and efforts in partnership with Wilson. And finally today, I just want to thank all of you for being here and for your commitment to the vital dialogue and the discussion we'll have today. So please now allow me to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Ousmane Dione, Vice President for MENA at the World Bank, and to give the floor first to Middle East Program Director Merissa Khurma, who will moderate the conversation. Thank you again, and I look forward to the discussions throughout the morning. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Riker, and thank you all for coming. And of course, I'd like to also welcome all our audience that is tuning in online. Dr. Ousmane Dione, we're very grateful for your time here today. You're now the Vice President for MENA at the World Bank, and it's a role that you've held since May of this year. And of course, this has been a very challenging and devastating year. I would say one of the most challenging years for the region in decades, with the brutal war in Gaza that has pretty much decimated the economy there, and now in Lebanon, but as also, as Ambassador Riker mentioned, in Sudan as well. Of course, with this work that you lead at the World Bank, and I quote, there's an emphasis on providing critical support to the region's countries that face a multitude of complex and multifaceted challenges, with a priority on the fragile and conflict-affected settings. But of course, even in non-conflict settings, there are many economic and social challenges that the region faces. So let's start with the World Bank strategy today. In the midst of these ongoing conflicts, how is the World Bank facilitating recovery and reconstruction? I remember, back in the summer, you were part of the launch of a report about the economic assessment of conflict. And of course, the picture looks very, very bleak right now. But you have been at it, leading the World Bank's work. So tell us a little bit more about the strategy that you're leading.
Thank you. Do you want me to go over there, or shall I stay here?
We can stay here. Yes.
Wonderful.
It's all ready.
It's on.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Marissa, for this introduction, and again, a great pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Riker, want to acknowledge your presence, and I think this program of MENA and Europe is an extremely important one. Friends and colleagues, I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I want really to express gratitude to the Wilson Center for bringing us together. This discussion of today's topic is not only important, but it is extremely timely. Coincidentally, I just got back last night from Brussels, where the first summit between the leaders of the European Union and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, took place under the theme Strategic Partnership for Peace and Prosperity. So indeed, our meeting today is extremely timely. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge what is in the mind of all of us: the ongoing conflict in the part of the Middle East and the profound suffering that comes with them. At the World Bank, we believe that peace is not just a prerequisite for development. It is essential. Conflict erodes decades of progress, and its human cost is just immeasurable. So as we focus on potential opportunities today, we must recognize that peace and stability must form the bedrock of our efforts. Let me turn my attention to today's topic, MENA and Europe. And as someone who grew up on both sides of the Mediterranean, I would like to share some reflection, especially looking at MENA development priorities. Let me start that beyond the painful history of colonization, which I want to acknowledge from the get-go, it is also essential to consider the deep ties between MENA and Europe. They are historical, political, geographical, economical, and even cultural. This region, MENA and Europe, have been connected for centuries, not just by proximity, but by shared histories, values, and aspirations. One of the most tangible examples of this connection between MENA and Europe is the Strait of Gibraltar, where the distance between Europe and North Africa is so narrow that one could imagine swimming across. By the way, as a joke, athletes like Hisham El Gerouj or Nawal Al Mutawakkil, we used to say that the Strait of Gibraltar is some kind of a warming up session for them. That is to say how that gap or the strait is a connector between MENA and Europe. And no one couldn't put it as beautifully as Mohammed Dib, the Algerian author who said once, "La mer est une rencontre entre nous et l'autre." In other words, the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, is a connector between us and the others. So the Mediterranean, often seen as a boundary, has in fact been a bridge between Europe and MENA. This connection forms the foundation of this shared future between MENA and Europe. But as we celebrate these ties, I want to highlight the challenges which MENA and Europe are facing and sharing, especially in this era of polycrisis, where crises overlap and compound. Climate change is a prime example. Every summer, both Europe and MENA face devastating bushfires. For any of you who have been on holidays, either on the northern part of the Mediterranean or on the southern part, this is something which may come across of your experience there. So these devastating bushfires not only threaten homes, livelihood, but also ecosystems on both sides. What happened on one side of the Mediterranean also happens on the other side. The shared threats remind us that the future of MENA and Europe are linked. and that solution must also be shared. Resilience is a key priority for both regions. Let's take MENA. With its young and dynamic population, a strategic geographical location, a vast potential, particularly in renewable energy. Countries like Morocco and Egypt are leading the way in solar and wind, for example, projects, and backed by European and World Bank partnership. Tunisia's ambitions in renewable energy through initiatives like the Tunisia-Italy link called MED is another example of connector on how currently Europe can take advantage of the huge potential of renewable energy which the Middle East and North Africa is offering. So this green transition is not just a priority for MENA. It is also one with Europe, whose Green Deal will increasingly depend on import of renewable energy from MENA. The two regions can build a resilient future by harnessing this potential and working together. MENA economic prosperity is also key for Europe. And it is not an exaggeration to say somehow a wealthy and prosperous Europe will always be stable, close to a poor and conflicted MENA. So currently 20%, if you take it from the perspective of trade, 20% of MENA trade is with Europe, 20%. But that figure can increase significantly if trade barriers are lowered. Our World Bank research shows that MENA countries could export 2 or 3 times more to Europe if full market access were achieved. And for some of you who will be interested, we will be releasing in the coming days the MENA economic update, which give you much more impetus with respect to those numbers. So the connection between MENA and Europe isn't just about trade neither. It is also about people. And this is a sensitive topic usually when we brought that issue on the table. But we do know that migration has been a force for change. And about 35% of MENA's migrants seek opportunities in Europe first. This movement of people can drive economic development for both regions, fostering greater social cohesion and innovation. Some facts. By 2030, the key demographics between Europe and Africa is that Europe is projected to have significantly older population compared to Africa. But it is the same, it is exactly the same for MENA. By 2050, 300 million young people from Middle East and North Africa region will be coming to the labor market. That is tomorrow. So this is where we need to recognize the connections and the gaps in the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean as a bridge and not a barrier. It is an illusion to think barriers can stop people from coming. This is not a topic perhaps to touch nowadays, but it is extremely important to understand the movement of people will depend on opportunities. And as opportunities rise in some part of the world, balancing those will be extremely important. And MENA and Europe is not an exception to this. We have seen those dynamics in many other parts in the world. So you may ask, what is the role of the World Bank in all of this? And why am I here today? We at the World Bank, we are committed to supporting this partnership between MENA and Europe. As a multilateral institution, we will continue to provide the resources in terms of financing whenever needed, the knowledge and better understanding the analytics and the potential wherever they are, and the convening power to help both regions achieve their shared goal. We are here to support transformative projects that drive resilience and prosperity for all. And what is good for MENA is also good for Europe. And what is good for Europe and MENA is also good for the World Bank. And isn't it ironic that today we are gathered here in Washington, D.C., far from both MENA and Europe, to discuss this crucial partnership? In a globalized world, geographic distance are no longer a barrier. Washington, as a global hub, reminds us that partnership can be leveraged from afar for global impacts. The United States, the US too, can play a significant role. An amplifying role of cooperation between MENA and Europe when it chooses to. And I do believe the United States will choose that path. Let me stop here for the sake of the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dione. So, first of all, I want to highlight key points from your remarks. Thank you for reminding us about the importance of the historical context, because with that, as you said, there are shared histories and values, and that's not going away, as you mentioned. If we can delve a little bit deeper into some of the key sectors that the World Bank is working on. I know that you personally are very committed to gender equality. We know that the MENA region has one of the lowest female labor participation rates in the world.
Right.
You also described the growing youth population, where that presents tremendous challenges, but also tremendous opportunities, because the education levels are actually quite high, but the private sector is not creating enough jobs. So how does the World Bank prioritize these key sectors to address some of these challenges, particularly when it comes to the growing youth population?
You know, this is an extremely important point which you're raising currently. And just, again, look at it from the perspective of the numbers. 300 million by 2050. On the 300 million, highly likely within the current context, 20% of them might have access to jobs in MENA. That is to say, we're going to face huge numbers of young people, educated, and potentially not having the opportunity. Now, this is where the notion of demographics become fundamentally important, because either it is a demographic dividend or a demographic liability. The question is, from a political perspective, from an economic perspective, what are the choices to make? And this is where looking at the opportunities which MENA has, looking at the notion of trade, the notion of cross-investment, promoting the private sector, how more investment can be done in MENA, whether it is related on the field of renewable energy with huge potential, whether it is related on the field, for example, of the green agenda, or even whether it is related to industrialization and accelerating digital services. So there is a set of opportunities across MENA where that young population can be really used in order to provide them better and more opportunities going forward. But it could be also done in the way, and some countries have started this path, on how currently some of those young people might be able to go to Europe, have a job, have experiences, gain resources, and even come back and reinvest on the development of their own countries. So this is the lens of those opportunities which we are looking as we move forward. What are the multiplier effects? What are the cross opportunities? And how reforms can be much more fast-tracked in order to give more room for the private sector. And on that path, I want to insist on one aspect which is fundamentally important, which is gender. And gender labor force in MENA is an extremely important issue, which we cannot just, close our eyes on it. And things on one way are changing, and on the other hand, there are also some issues of concerns. And I will give you two examples. In 3 years, Saudi Arabia was able to move from almost 16% of its female labor force to almost 37% in 3 years. That is to say, when there is a leadership, when there is political will, when the reforms are being properly put in place and implemented, there is a possibility to move. On the other hand, we do see some countries who in the past have been the champion of the liberalization of gender in the Arab world, like, for example, Tunisia, where currently the trend is currently going downward. That is to say, there is room for improvement on how we can accelerate, but where also others need currently, to catch up going forward. And that has to do mostly with, first, policies, political will, reform, and diversifying opportunities for women across MENA region.
And of course, as long as the World Bank is having these conversations with the key governments and the private sector, it remains in the public sphere, and it highlights the importance. I want to thank you again for your time. I know that you have another engagement, but if I can squeeze in one more question. You talked about the importance of economic prosperity of MENA and how that benefits Europe. And so we're not just looking at stability, but we want to go all the way to prosperity. Can you just describe very briefly how some of these barriers you talked about can be addressed, and the role of the World Bank in this regard?
This is where knowledge and facts become fundamentally important. One of the powerful instruments which we provide first and foremost to our client countries in MENA is to give them the knowledge, the facts, to understand their potential, to look at what are also their barriers, and then to piggyback on what are the potential for reform. For example, just to give you an example, one of the key aspects which we do see as a barrier in many countries in MENA is related currently, to the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises. And even in some countries, a number of those SOEs are within the hand of the army. Okay. Now, MENA is not an exception to this. Some other countries across the world were on that situation. And at some point, they were able to enact policies to put in place a business environment which progressively reformed and allowed more and more competition, allowed private sector to come in, and then to spur more investment. One example is Vietnam. And I have been the country director of Vietnam. And when I look at currently the progress in many ways which Vietnam have done, if I had to compare it with one single country in MENA with respect to catching up, it will be Algeria. That is to say, from our perspective, providing the knowledge, helping them put in place the right reforms, including bringing to them lessons, experiences, and best practices, and if needed, accompanying them financially on the way through which those reforms could be important, is part of our strategy. And the other element related to that is internally. We have also come a long way in making sure that all our products can come together. We talk nowadays as one World Bank. You take our guarantee instrument. All of them have been consolidated into one single platform through MIGA, which provide an opportunity to cut the spectrum of any guaranteed products you want. Mm-hmm. You take currently the way we work with our private sector arms, IFC. In many countries now, we are having joint representative. That is to say, we talk from public policies, but also we talk from private opportunities and how to bridge the gap between the two and to offer our clients in MENA, but across the world, a set of instruments in a platform they will be able to use in order to accelerate their economic transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as you said, at the heart of advancing these reforms is the political will across the board. We thank you so much for taking time to be with us this morning and sharing the World Bank's strategy in MENA, but also how, as you said, MENA's prosperity is important for Europe and how this is important for the United States as well as the world. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue with you. And thank you very much.
My great pleasure.
Please stay seated. The panel is about to start.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Welcome everyone also from my side. I'm Masha Zwirk and I'm the program coordinator here at the Global Europe program, and I work together with my colleague Yusuf Khan on this project on the future of Euro-MENA relations. I would first like to thank Dr. Ousmane Dione and Director Khurma for their excellent takeaways. I think to summarize, what is good for Europe is good for MENA and vice versa is a great segue for our panel discussion on the challenges and opportunities when it comes to migration between Europe and the MENA region. Migration has definitely had a defining impact on this relationship, particularly over the last decade. And speaking of geography matters, the Mediterranean route has become the most active crossing in this regard, with thousands of people seeking refuge and better opportunities in Europe, but as well, unfortunately, too many losing lives while attempting this. In this response, the European Union has entered into several agreements with MENA countries to manage these migration flows and tackle human smuggling. However, as I think we're all familiar, this approach has also been met with mixed reactions, often criticized for building a fortress Europe and failing to holistically address the problem. It has also affected Europe's relations with its southern neighborhood. And as people continue to make the dangerous journey to Europe, fleeing war, poverty, natural disasters, the key question, and if I may borrow Dr. Dione's words, the key question is how to make the Mediterranean a bridge and not a barrier. And I believe our speakers today are very well equipped to talk about how both regions can better leverage cooperation to address migration challenges. And I would say while their research does focus on the specific dynamics between Europe and MENA, we've heard today that migration is a global phenomenon. So I believe their policy recommendations are also relevant for other stakeholders that are dealing with migration challenges and also addressing the polarized discourse surrounding it. And with that, I would like to introduce our speakers today that are with us. First, Asli Elitsoy, who's the Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Copenhagen. Her research focuses on the domestic political factors behind Turkey's use of coercive engineered migration as a strategic foreign policy tool in the context of the EU-Turkey migration deal that was signed in 2016. Next, we have Alisa Pavia, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's North Africa Program. Her paper explores the evolution and impact of the EU's migration agreements with North African countries and how the EU can focus on a more balanced and integrated approach to migration management. And joining us virtually from Cairo is Aza Guergues, an independent journalist, and her paper examines the role of refugee-led organizations and the potential benefit of funding these organizations amid growing challenges, especially transit countries such as Egypt are dealing with when hosting migrants and refugees. I hope you all have been able to read their excellent policy papers. While they broadly deal with the same topic, they do show how complex of a challenge migration actually is. And I would first like to start with Asli. In your research, you examined the instrumentalization of migration known as coercive engineered migration. Your study uniquely focuses on how this strategy both affects and is shaped by domestic political dynamics in Turkey. Could you tell us a bit more about your findings? And based on these findings, how is this coercive tool used by political actors and how it can be helpful for us to understand also internal political dynamics?
Thank you. As you say, in my research, I focus on the concept of coercive engineered migration, especially in the aftermath of the 2016 deal between the European Union and Turkey to manage irregular migration. Actually, this deal was initially planned as a mutual cooperation in managing irregular migration from third countries, as we can see the Turkey as a transit country into the Europe. But in my paper, I argue that this deal also facilitated the instrumentalization of migrants and refugees for broader political objectives, both internally and externally. So externally, as we know, as we've seen in many occasions, the AKP government under Erdogan's presidency manipulate the migrants and refugees and migration flows in order to gain political and economic concessions from the European Union. And for example, I think this was one of the most significant examples we see in 2020. So when, Erdogan couldn't get international support for Turkey's military operations in northern Syria. So, and then we see the government push the refugees into the border areas, for example, and this also caused a humanitarian crisis. So internally, the AKP government under Erdogan also used coercive engineered migration for domestic political purposes. So my analysis shows that. And in particular, we see this in the establishment of so-called security zones in northern Syria. Because as we know, as a result of the Syrian war, the Syrian Kurds gain a kind of an autonomous region in this place. And my analysis, especially my analysis of parliamentary documents, shows that this raised the concerns for the Turkish state elite. So I think, one of the main reason is that the understanding is that, that any Kurdish gains in northern Syria could be an inspiration source for Turkey's Kurds. So in this sense, with this purpose, they announced the creation of so-called safe zones as a Sunni buffer zone between the Syrian Kurds and the Turkish Kurds. But of course, they justify the establishment of so-called safe zones in northern Syria as, as facilitator of the, the safe zone, let's say, were created. This was the government's claim for the safe return of Syrian refugees to the northern Syria. So in this sense, we see that, the instrumentalization or manipulation of migration goes hand in hand with domestic national security concerns in Turkey. On the opposition side, of course, we see the huge criticism. Especially the opposition MPs use parliamentary questions, although the majority of them remain unanswered, to criticize this, the government's use of refugees as bargaining chips in international relations, especially in Turkey's relations with the European Union. So, in short, I can say that this continuous debate surrounding the 2016 deal between Turkey and the European Union, I think, shows us that, the coercive engineer migration also feel negative perceptions of refugees and migrants on the one hand, and it also, strengthened the political divisions domestically, and it's, also, heightened the political polarization in the coercive state, not just the target state.
Thank you. Next, I'll move to Elisa. In your paper, you identify some key trends in how EU migration deals, how EU strikes migration deals with third countries, beginning with the 2016 agreement with Turkey. Could you tell us a bit more, what are some of these key trends and what did they reveal about EU's approach to managing migration?
Well, first of all, can everyone hear me? Is this on? Okay. I wanted to thank you, Masa, and Yusuf for bringing this important project to fruition. Also, I want to extend my heartfelt thank yous to Merissa and Robin and Ambassador Riker as well. This was a great project that we've been working on for a year, and I'm very excited and happy to be here. Before I delve into that question, I do want to take a step back and kind of, with the audience, remind our audience where we are at in terms of the EU deals with third countries, especially from North Africa and the Middle East. So I specifically looked at deals with North Africa because that is my region of focus. And so taking a step back, I think the two deals that most will remember are the EU-Turkey deal from 2016 and the following subsequent, Italy-Libya memorandum that was endorsed by the European Union. And these deals were struck respectively in 2016 and 2017, whereby the EU basically implemented its strategy to outsource migration outside of its borders, right? And that was the first time we saw the EU undertake this new strategy to deal with the migration issue, okay? What this meant was that instead of waiting for refugees and migrants to arrive to the European Union, the EU outsourced the management to third countries so that it would prevent people from arriving in the first place, and that would facilitate Europe's position in terms of relocating and resettlement and so on and so forth. After these two deals were struck, the EU then, there was a 5-year period where nothing really happened, and then in 2023, the EU again struck a similar deal with Tunisia. And then since then, the EU has struck 4 new deals, so one with Tunisia, Mauritania, Egypt, and Lebanon. And so today, I think we can draw some conclusions on what works and what doesn't work, and we can make some presumptions of where we think the European Union is going to go moving forward. And so this leads me to answer your questions on the trends. So the trends that are noticeable from the research is that, like you mentioned, the externalization and the securitization approaches are still very much present in these deals, and we can expect them to continue moving forward, okay? So in future deals with third countries, we can expect the European Union to maintain the same strategy. The externalization method, again, as I mentioned before, is that approach by which the EU outsources migration management to third countries. And this has a number of implications that we can look into later. The securitization approach is that approach by which the EU looks at migrants and migration as a security issue. And if in the past we used to see a narrative whereby there was a focus on the security threats that could emanate from, mass migration, today we see it more so in the focus on fighting human smuggling, right? And so if one looks at speeches and official documents by both the European Union and member states, there's always a focus on human smuggling. That's not necessarily a wrong thing, but human smuggling is a problem and it should be tackled, but it's not the sole issue driving migration. Another trend is this constant prioritization of migration when dealing with North Africa. And so if one looks at the trajectory of the European Union's handling of its relationship with the southern neighborhood from the 90s to today, there is a clear trajectory whereby the EU has switched from, looking for a comprehensive and strategic agreement and framework from the Barcelona process, for example, which was a process where, the EU was looking at North Africa and the region in a partnership way, right? So it's southern neighborhood as its neighbor, whereas now all the deals focus primarily on stemming irregular migration. And then, last but not least, there are intra-institutional tensions that emerge between institutions within the European Union. Particularly, we've seen tensions between the European Parliament and the European Commission on the ways in which the Commission has decided to deal with migration, and these can lead to significant problems for the EU going forward. And I'll stop there.
So one of these, the recent agreements you've mentioned and you dealt with is with Egypt, and that brings me to our next speaker, Aza. Your research focuses on the situation in Egypt and the challenges displaced people face there. Could you provide us a bit more insight into the current landscape in Egypt, especially in the context of the war in Sudan, and highlight some of the major challenges refugees and displaced people, migrants encounter when seeking protection there?
Thank you, Masha, and thanks to the panel and the audience in the room and online. So my research focuses on refugee-led organizations or community-based organizations led by migrants and the work they have been doing in Egypt, especially in the past year and a half after the war in Sudan erupted. They have been a lifeline for migrants in Egypt, providing them with shelter, healthcare services, food, cash assistance, and also psychosocial support sessions for women survivors of gender-based violence. But they are underfunded as they only rely on donations from the community and the diaspora, and they are underrepresented in migration-related policy making. So my research explores why it's essential to back them, held by around 100 refugee-led organizations in Egypt. Some of them are registered and others not. especially now in a period of several conflicts that resulted in the forced displacement of many people from Sudan and Gaza to Egypt. While international organizations have been so slow in providing aid, they need to follow an emergency response in times of wars, like establishing refugee camps as shelters for people to stay for some time and providing them with food and healthcare services. But Egypt doesn't allow refugee camps to people across the borders to urban areas struggling to survive because they have left wars in their countries with nothing. So the ones who have been helping them are refugee-led organizations. And also the process of international organization to aid people takes a lot of time. They follow normally a lengthy and bureaucratic process. First, to register migrants, assess their needs. This process can take months and even years, while people fleeing war need normally emergency aid. My research also discusses the challenges that displaced people face in Egypt. So on papers, refugees and migrants have the right to work, but they normally are not given work permits to work in the formal economy. So almost all of them join the informal economy, which lacks, of course, health insurance and a lot of protection. And over the past few years, many studies have pushed for the need to have a national asylum law in Egypt. And since last year, Egypt has been drafting this law, but its provisions haven't been made public. So we are waiting for this national asylum law, hoping that kind of will provide some protections for refugees. But there are some concerns that it might not follow the international treaties that Egypt signs, like the 1951 conventions. So we are waiting for this asylum law. I have discussed the legal landscape in Egypt and how refugees cannot work and have access to public education. Well, Arab refugees and migrants can access public education, but non-Arab refugees and migrants cannot access public education. So I discussed this also in my research and kind of what I have seen on the ground while reporting on Sudanese migrants and refugees over the past year and a half. What I saw is that the ones who have been helping people are refugee-led organizations, and to kind of really achieve kind of refugees' welfare. I think supporting them will benefit their communities. My research also discussed the need to urgently have this national asylum law in Egypt that can protect migrants' rights and addresses the challenges, whether joining the labor market, accessing public education, and social protection services in the country. Sorry. The study also highlights the need to advocate for political reforms, social protection, and also job development for migrants and for locals, especially in poverty-stricken areas in Egypt. And yeah, I think that supporting refugee-led organization will not only benefit migrants and refugees, but also host communities from Egyptians, as they also offer services to Egyptians too. So yeah, that's in a nutshell my research.
And this brings me back to speaking of course, how domestic frameworks are important, and brings me to Asli again. You analyzed over, let's say, 1,000 parliamentary speeches and questions, looking at how the government and the opposition side framed the migration deal with the European Union. Could you tell us a bit more about what effects has this discourse from both sides had on the domestic political polarization on the issue of migration and more generally, as well as how has it affected the perception and as well the situation of migrants and refugees communities in Turkey?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you said, I analyzed about 1,000 parliamentary documents qualitatively in order to make my analysis. And first of all, I have to say that the new regime of Turkey is now called as the competitive authoritarian regime by the political scientists. But still, I mean, when I analyze parliamentary documents, I see that especially parliamentary questions, written parliamentary questions, remain as a key tool for opposition members of parliament in order to raise some specific criticism towards some government policies or put some certain issues into the parliamentary agenda. So interestingly, I mean, search for some specific keywords in the online archives of the Turkish parliament. And then I collected, as I said, about 1,000 parliamentary documents. But interestingly, I didn't find even one parliamentary question submitted by the ruling party members. So in this sense, I can say that, I mean, they mainly serve for the opposition members. And this is also shows us how opposition framed the EU-Turkey deal of 2016. So basically, I use a specific software. It is called as MaxQDA that we use as researchers to, analyze a huge data. And then I identify 4 major framing strategies used by the Turkish MPs, opposition MPs, to frame the EU-Turkey deal. So the first one actually is, can I say that as violation, the framing of the agreement or the deal as the violation of human rights and dignity. So this was one of the 4 major framing strategies. So this frame used by the main opposition party members and the pro-Kurdish party members mainly. So they highlight the deal actually violates refugee rights, and they often emphasize mistreatment of refugees in the camps, and of course, not to mention poor conditions in the repatriation camps that were built for refugees who came back or who forced back to Turkey from Greece. And of course, I mean, they often mention that's in the agency and the human trafficking, and they also raise concerns about them. One of the reasons of huge numbers of deaths in the agency and the increasing human trafficking is a result of the Turkish authorities' oversight in the agency. So this was another interesting finding. And of course, I mean, some of them also highlights the mistreatment of refugees in the refugee camps in Greece. So in this sense, they also, call the government, the Turkish government, to collaborate with the Greece authorities in this sense. And the opposite framing strategy that I called as security threat and economic burden framing. And usually right-wing parties, the members of the right-wing parties, both, like the coalition partner of the ruling AKP and the other right-wing opposition party members, they occasionally see refugees, especially those who sent back from Europe, from Bulgaria and from Greece back to Turkey, as a economic burden to already fragile economy of Turkey and a security threat. So they often mention the establishment of repatriation centers in Turkey's popular tourism hubs on the Aegean coast. And they claim that, these repatriation camps would harm the tourism revenues and the local economy. And in addition to that, they also highlight the demographic shift, the fear of demographic shift in the cities next to the Aegean coast. And another claim or another argument raised by the opposition members, especially those who have, the right-wing ideology, they say that, or they claim that the European Union sent, especially those who have criminal records, sent back to Turkey. And that's why, the refugees who sent back from Greece to Turkey will threaten the security of the communities in the cities. And I think the third and another interesting frame was the framing the deal as a facilitator of corruption. I think this is mainly because of the lack of transparency and accountability, because we still don't know how the government actually spent the money or spent the financial aid that was given by the European Union for the refugees. So usually government refused to give information about how this money was spent, both to the European Union authorities and to the opposition members, because opposition MPs usually raise questions of how the government spent the money. But as I said, the majority, not just majority, actually almost all of them remain unanswered. So there is a huge lack of accountability and transparency in this sense. So this is also, another biggest problem that I identify. And lastly, I will also mention to that very briefly, the fourth framing is that opposition members usually criticize the AKP's use of coercive engineer migration as something that will be damage to Turkey's international reputation. Especially if you remember in 2020, we see another refugee crisis. As I said, the government pushed the Syrian refugees to the border areas, and this incident actually was highly criticized by the opposition members. So, and as a last word, I just wanted to say that, there is not a unique perspective in each country. So we should, I think, consider that, yes, the government is an important actor, but we have also different stakeholders and different perspectives, right? So we should also consider them when we, develop policies and policy recommendations. Thank you.
So yeah, you've mentioned the international reputation affecting Turkey, but this has also been a concern when it comes to the European Union, especially being with this approaches of externalization and securitization. And these are two key trends that you identified, Alisa, in your paper. We see that migration continues to be a top priority for the European Union. Today, European Council leaders are meeting precisely on this topic, but with both the European Parliament shifting slightly right, with a lot of national elections resulting in slightly more right-wing shifts, we do see that migration continues to be primarily framed as a security issue. Looking ahead, what do you see are the biggest challenges for Europe if it continues with, as you call it, such a narrow approach through a security lens?
So first of all, I also want to highlight that, let's say more hardline stances on migration have been adopted from both the right and the left in Europe, right? So I think there's a misconception of thinking that it's only and solely a right-wing approach. But going back to your question on, what are the implications of the trends that I've seen, that I've analyzed so far? When it comes to the externalization issue, the biggest potential complication comes from the potential of being complicit in human rights abuses, right? And so there have been multiple accounts we know over the years from coming out of North African countries, specifically Libya and now Tunisia, of severe human rights abuses happening, specifically directed at migrants. Oftentimes, this is a strategy that is utilized to try to deter migrants from reaching these countries in the first place. However, what we see is a severe crackdown on their rights and on their humanitarian needs. And human rights organizations, NGOs, have voiced their concerns over the years in multiple occasions that they fear that EU funds have been used in this direction and have been used in the violation of human rights. And so this can create some legal challenges for the EU, its member states, and some of its political leaders, because the EU is party to the International Criminal Court. And there have been cases where individuals have been brought forward to the International Criminal Court because of their alleged complicity in human rights abuses. So that is one issue that the EU and its leaders may face in the future. With regards to the securitization approach, I think that by narrowing and oversimplifying the issue to that of one solely linked to human smuggling might lead to this misperception and to a misleading of the public for the public opinion that if human smuggling is defeated, then migration will disappear. And we know that that's very far from the truth, because migration has existed far before human smuggling networks have been created, and it will continue to exist later. And so in a post-Brexit world, we know very well what the erosion of trust between European citizens and its institution can lead to. And so this can create problems in the future where Europeans will be asking their EU leaders, hey, wait, we've defeated human smuggling. Why is migration still an issue, right? And then quickly on the other two trends. I also mentioned earlier that we've noticed fissures and difficult interinstitutional relations and tensions between the European Parliament and the European Commission. And what I was referring to was the EU-Tunisia deal that was signed in 2023, whereby the Commission, headed by Team Europe, so Meloni, von der Leyen, and Rutte, signed an agreement with Tunisian President Kais Saied, but it was unbeknownst to the European Parliament. They only found out about this later when it was already signed. This created tensions, and if and at the end of the day, it does boil down also to ideological opinions and ideological positions within the European Parliament. And so these tensions can lead to weaknesses, and we know that external malign actors will exploit these weaknesses to weaken overall the bloc. So that is something that the EU should consider. And last but not least, with this shift of EU-Med relations towards a hyper-focus on migration, this tends to lead to an erosion of trust from North African countries towards European countries. I see this all the time when I speak to government officials from North Africa. Whenever they are approached to sign any sort of deal, whether it's energy, fisheries, phosphate, anything, at the end they will always say, yes, but the EU is only interested in stemming migration. So why should we enter in this agreement? At the end of the day, this is their real objective. So there is a clear erosion of trust, which in the long term will hinder the European Union's ability to sign future agreements with third countries. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the things you mentioned is, of course, the issue of ensuring humanitarian needs of displaced people in these third countries, transit countries. And I think this is where refugee-led organizations also play an important role. And I would turn now to Aza again. If you already gave us a bit of a broad overview of the situation in Egypt, and I think you've done an excellent research on the work of refugee-led organizations. So could you tell us a bit more about how do these organizations work? How do they, what is their role in mitigating these challenges that refugees and displaced people face, specifically in Egypt?
Well, refugee-led organizations, the ones I spoke with, have been working in Egypt for so many years. They have been established by migrants. Just one second. I don't see you, Masha.
Do you
Excuse
hear
me.
us?
I think I have. I don't see you. Yeah.
But we can hear you, so it's okay. You
Okay.
can continue.
They have been working in Egypt for many years. They were established by Sudanese who fled the war in Darfur in 2003. And their work is designed to fill the gaps left by the state, but the host country, Egypt, in this case, Egypt, and also UNHCR. So their work has been essential so far. And what I want to say, sorry, but can I see you? Because I only see myself, and I just want to. I'm not sure if there is a technical issue.
We have to get an advice from the AV team on that.
I see myself and I feel distracted by my image. I see only myself on the screen. Yeah. Thank you.
That as a compliment.
They have been working in Egypt for so many years. They provide, as I said, a lot of services. They provide a lot of services, food, shelter. They could, for instance, rent a flat for many families who have been struggling with homelessness. They provide a lot of services, also some education. They have some education centers for children who prefer to receive the Sudanese education, and also because sometimes they suffer from bullying and racism in Egyptian schools, so they prefer their own schools too. And these schools are established by refugee-led groups. And for instance, last year I visited a refugee-led organization or community-based organization, because they also prefer the word community-based organization, since it means they also serve not only migrants but also host the community, and they do that. So last year I visited a CBO in Cairo, and I had an interview for 15 minutes with a nurse. Her name is Salsabil Abdullah. She was offering psychosocial support sessions to women survivors of gender-based violence. And when I went to visit her, to see her, I went in a corridor and I saw a room that was full of Sudanese women who went there to attend psychosocial support sessions. And it was really good to see this, knowing the stigma surrounding mental health in MENA, and seeing people that they went there to seek a professional help. So this is one of the services they offer or they provide. And I don't think international organizations could do this session without Sudanese. I don't think Sudanese women would talk to an Egyptian therapist or a foreign therapist, but they will go and talk to their own people who knows the culture and knows the tradition and know the history of sexual violence in Sudan. So this is one example. So far, what I have seen from reporting, they have been on the front line of the humanitarian response in Egypt. They need support and funding to continue their massive work, and also some of the services they offer handicraft workshops to single mothers. So Sudanese single mothers who fled war with babies and children will not be able to work. Go and join the informal economy, but learning how to do handicrafts in home, this can generate income for them while staying in home with their children. So they know the needs, they know how they can help Sudanese meet these needs. And even UNHCR acknowledged their role in helping their community. UNHCR policy for 2009 recognized the role of refugee-led organizations, and the organization, the UN agency said it will follow a community-based approach, working with these organizations to help migrants and refugees. But this community-based approach has not been fully implemented until now. So UNHCR need to work with them because they are the ones who are fully informed about the needs of their communities and how they can address them.
So as I already talked a bit about some effective policies that could be implemented to, for instance, support refugee-led organizations in a case of Egypt. And Asti, before you've mentioned that the coercive use of migration has a broader negative effect on Turkey's international relations, but also domestic polarization, as your research shows, and the public sentiment towards migrants.
Yeah.
What do you see are some maybe effective policies that could mitigate the impact of using migration in this manner?
Yeah. Actually, as a scholar, we don't usually focus on the policy recommendations, so this was a kind of a new experience and a practice for me. So, but I did my best. And as you said, you know, the use of coercive migration, the employment of coercive migration have some external and internal implications, both for the coercive state and the target states, of course. So, and of course, I mean, maybe one of the biggest things is that, you know, that it shifts the focus from the humanitarian needs of the refugees to, you know, the internal political debates. So to tackle with these problems, several policy recommendations can be considered, I think. And a key policy recommendation is, I think, to stop international military interventions and limit the sale of arms to conflicting parties. And because, you know, we know that conflicts and wars are one of the biggest reasons of massive refugee flows. So in this sense, you know, not feeling already ongoing regional conflicts and wars could be key to address the root causes of the migration crisis. So the second thing, I think, is the second important thing, I think, is to depolarize the public discourse, because as we've seen, I mean, I just focus on one case, but I'm sure, I mean, we can identify several different examples in other countries, especially in North Africa. So migration and the deal with the European Union is a highly polarized issue. So the polarization is important, and in order to do that, I think the European authorities should also consider the involvement of the other stakeholders, like opposition parties, civil society members, human rights groups, not just you know, the governments, usually, you know, the authoritarian governments. So inclusiveness and the transparency, accountability, I think these are the keys. And then so in this sense, you know, I mean, the depolarization could be happen, and then the shared responsibility, you know, like would ensure the effective migration management. So because, you know, the coercive engineer migration also, you know, prevent the effective management of migration, the international migration. So and the third policy recommendation, especially regarding these deals with the third countries to manage irregular migration, I think is the transparency, as I said, but the establishment of international or the independent monitoring mechanisms would be important, especially how the funds coming from the EU for refugees would be spent. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you. Thank you.
I think you've mentioned some really good points in terms of deeper polarization of the topic, also addressing the root causes of migration. And I think that's also something you both share with Alisa in terms of policy recommendations when it comes to managing migration in a more holistic way. So, Elisa, yeah, one of your policy recommendations focuses on addressing more the root causes of migration. And you mentioned a very specific program, which is the Global Gateway, which I found particularly interesting in terms of how the EU could utilize this program, especially for North African countries. So could you share a bit more about that, and what do you see what are some other policy recommendations, especially for the EU?
Right. So as Asli said, the policy recommendations are always the hardest part of the papers, and I wholeheartedly sympathize with policymakers that have to then deal with, yes, like us criticizing them and then them finding actual solutions. So, but like you said, with the Global Gateway Initiative, I think the EU has made strides, particularly since 2023, in trying to address the root causes of migration, okay? So if one looks at the deals before and after 2017, so Libya, the deals before were solely focused on migration, and after there are different pillars that seem to address other issues that should, generally address the root causes of migration. So it is important to say that and to praise the European Union where praise is needed. And so with the Global Gateway Initiative, at the end of the day, it is a strategy to it's a strategy for the African continent, and there can be a lot of overlap between the projects that the European Union envisions and those that can actually help with the reduction of poverty and increasing job security and jobs, and these are all, we know, root causes of migration. And so if this is properly utilized, it can help with overall migration, with migration management in the long term. Other policy recommendations, one that I added, I know is quite contentious, is the adoption of conditionalities when entering into agreements and providing financial incentives to third countries. I know that it's a contentious issue because even when I speak to government officials from North Africa, they criticize the EU for having too tough of a stance and conditions that are too tough and that they cannot meet, and also for the EU having double standards. And these are all pertinent issues, valid issues that they bring up. At the same time, however, the EU is a ideological institution. It has an EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and Values, and it does need to abide to those. And so the only way to do that is to impose some sort of condition whereby the EU can monitor where and how its money is utilized. Now, these conditions do not have to be the harshest. They can be negotiated. This is something I always say to our partners in the region. What I notice in certain countries is that the moment they ask for any conditions, they will step back from the negotiating table and say, we don't talk to EU partners anymore. This is happening now with Tunisians and the IMF, whereby the Tunisians do not want to enter into agreement with the IMF because of the conditions. I don't think the solution is to not negotiate. I think the solution is to renegotiate those conditions, because oftentimes when I speak to EU leaders and IMF leaders, they always say we are ready to renegotiate these conditions. When it comes to human smuggling, this is something that's already been that's been said in the past, but one way to drive human smuggling networks out of business is to increase legal pathways for migration. Some countries have made strides in this direction, and one of them is surprisingly Italy. Italy and Tunisia have signed an agreement recently whereby they provide 4,000 visas to Tunisians to enter regularly into the country, and I think that these are the steps that can, in the long term, help drive out of business illegal smugglers. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Yeah. And then speaking of EU support and EU actions, financial incentives, I would now turn also to Aza about the potential that you see in terms of the EU and also other international actors and funders to better support, for instance, the work of refugee-led organizations? Because I think there is a thread throughout all of your papers is also the support for civil society actors when it comes to more holistically manage the challenges of migration.
Yes, I think refugee-led organizations in Egypt need the financial support. When I met them last year for a reporting piece I wrote, they told me, yes, they needed donations because of the scale of the need, especially now. When I was writing the research in the summer, the number of refugee and migrants who fled war in Sudan was 500,000. It now reached more than 1 million, according to data from the Egyptian government and also UNHCR and even refugee-led organizations. So the scale of the need is massive, and they need financial support. But the good thing is that when I met them last year, they needed, yes, financial support. But when I met them again for this research, they told me they got some grants from international organizations, and an international organization in Cairo provided them with capacity building training. And one of the organizations I spoke with already in the final stage of registering, because it's really hard to register an organization in Egypt, especially led by migrants. And even civil society organizations in Egypt face a lot of challenges to register because of security reasons and the political situation in Egypt. So they face a lot of challenges when it comes to registering, but one of them is already on the final stage of registering. And the head of this organization is a woman, is a Sudanese woman. And she told me that some staff from the international organizations that provided them with capacity building programs, the Egyptian staff joined her so she can register her organization. To register a refugee-led organization, they need 75% from the board of directors to be Egyptian. They need locals with them to be able to register. And since they serve migrants, most of the people they serve are migrants. Not many Egyptians join them, but the Egyptian staff in the international organization partnered with this refugee-led group, and they are now in the final stage of registering this organization. So they need registration so they can apply for grants and all of that stuff, and they can work in a formal way. So this is registration, but the good thing, as I said, they got grants from last year to the time I met them for the research in May. And I myself got approached by 2 UN agencies who wanted their contacts to do 2 projects with them. I'm not sure if they started these projects or not, but it's essential that international organizations partner with them so they can serve migrants and refugee communities in Egypt. And I really have noticed improvements in their work. Like when I met them last year, one of the organizations was in a very small flat. But when I met them, the organization head again for this research, they moved to a very big flat and they hired more staff. So there have been some improvements in the past few years. And as I said, they got some grants. They still need financial support to keep doing their work and achieve self-reliance within their communities. So this one thing. And also, I think it's important to listen to them. They are the ones who are migrants and refugees. I learned a lot from them. I read books and journalistic pieces, but I learned the most from them. They know how hard is the journey to leave their country with nothing and move to another country. They know how to adapt. They know their rights and they are well informed. So it's important that policymakers sit with them and ask them what are the needs, how they can improve migrants' conditions, and how they can help them achieve self-reliance so they don't need aid in the first place. So yeah, I also discussed the importance of having asylum law in Egypt, national asylum law that can push for rights and protections for migrants and refugees. And I think this will help, but also refugee-led organization in working and scaling their operations in Egypt and all of that stuff. So yeah, that's what I can remember for now.
Yeah, so I think such positive stories and developments do provide a good incentive for actors to further support the work of such organizations. And I would now like to turn to our audience, because I'm sure after all these excellent points from our speakers, you have plenty of questions. So please raise your hand, quickly introduce yourself, if you can put, just there.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I'm a little surprised by the continuous reaction of Egypt to allow Palestinians across the border into Sinai. And I'm wondering if you guys can shed any light on that. We have Iran admitting Afghanis for a long period of time. We have Turkey admitting Syrians for a long period of time. We have Chad admitting Sudanese right now. So there's a lot of tradition here. And all of a sudden, Egypt is taking a very hard line against these refugees. Can anybody shed any light on that? Is there any buttons we can press to convince him to lighten up until the conflict in Gaza has lessened?
Thank you. Do you want to?
I can
address.
I can take that. Egypt is in a very difficult spot right now. I will say that, Egypt is dealing with, even from before the Israel-Gaza war, Egypt hosts about between 6 to 10 million refugees from around the world. That has had enormous implications on Egypt's economy. And if, from my understanding from when I speak to Egyptian officials, if they were to let in any more migrants, their economy will severely feel those implications. And so, as of now,
We'll feed them.
The issue, though, is that the fear, from my understanding, is that then the Israelis will not allow the Palestinians to return back to their homes. This has happened in the past. And so there is a real fear that the Israelis will not allow the return of Palestinians back into Gaza. And that would mean that Egypt would have to basically integrate between, I don't know how many thousands, but up to 1 million Palestinians into its society. And I think that any country, if faced with the idea with having to integrate 1 million people all of a sudden into its society, will understand that any society understandably will put some barriers to that. I mean, we did that in Europe with the Syrian migrants crisis. So,
Excuse me, I wanted to add just one line. Just quickly, but just I want to say that 100,000 Palestinians have fled Gaza to Egypt already, and they are now in Egypt. I met some of them for a story I wrote, and no one of them told me he wants to be a refugee or migrant. So they are the ones who have the decision to say, I want to be a refugee or migrant or not. No one of them told me he wants to be a refugee or she wants to be a refugee or migrant. They just want residency permit to stay in Egypt for some time and then return back to Gaza again. And as Elisa said, there is a fear that Israel will not allow Palestinians to go back to Gaza again. So it's a bit of a sensitive issue. And I think Gazans are the ones who have the decision to say, hey, I want to be a refugee or migrant, or I don't want to be. And the one I spoke with, around 10 people, told me, no, they want to go back to Gaza again. And they are only in Egypt for some months or maybe years, but they will go back again. So they are the ones who decide they want to immigrate or not. Thank you.
Asli, you want to?
Yeah, just a few words about, like, it's not just Egypt, the rich Gulf countries, they also, they're also reluctant to take more refugees, or maybe less than this. So, but I think, it's not just feeding them. So millions of refugees, it's, they had very difficult, the political and social implications for these countries. So the integration and the management of all these affairs needs, the strong and state institutions. And I'm really skeptical about, the neighboring countries have this, this. And then I think, and it's not fair, like while the EU sealing its borders, and then force the neighboring countries to take more refugees. I think that's all.
Okay, here in the middle row. Here.
I have a.
I'm trying to. I'm also trying to ensure a balance between.
I want to thank you for the research that you've done. I represent Afro-Descendant Media International Research. And in the book here, it talks about centrality of education. Is education to produce a person to be employed, or is it to produce a whole human being?
Would like to address that.
The question was if education?
Is education?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
From the information here that talks about the centrality of education, the supply side is called, is the purpose of an education to groom or produce an employee or to make a whole person?
Okay, but
So
I think
just to point out, the research you're referring to is not the research we're talking about today, but I will still. It is on the table. It's part of our broader work, but we're today talking about a different type of research. But I will still let, if anyone wants to address this.
I would like to, because we conducted the research in Turkey 3 years ago, and I see that, since now we're focusing on migration-related issues, maybe I can give an answer to that question within this framework of migration. So the educational rights of refugee children is another problem for these countries that host, a huge number of refugees. We can also, not just Turkey, like in North Africa, and we can also talk about Egypt, Lebanon. So actually, as I said, the local institutions in these countries need assistance, especially from the European Union, in order to improve the education infrastructure, especially for the refugee children. The first thing is the language barrier, of course, and sometimes, as I seen in the Turkish case, the cultural barriers also played a role. For example, when we conduct this research, we saw that one of the biggest problems for the Syrian girls in Turkey, especially in getting education, was that culturally, the families are not willing to send their girls to the school after the 12 or 13 age. So this is another problem. So here, we have a a holistic approach, and education is a very important dimension, I think, in the refugee issues. Thank you.
So unfortunately, as it's always the case with these excellent panels, we've run out of time. However, our authors are going to be here throughout the conference, and we are now having the lunch break, so I think it's a great opportunity for all of you to ask them questions directly. I would like to, first of all, thank our speakers for their excellent work and their excellent input today. And of course, thank you to all the audience for engaging with us on such a vital issue. And I would please ask you to also join us for the second panel discussion, which will be after the lunch break. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
moderation.
Hi everyone. Thank you again for coming to today's conference. I hope you guys had a good lunch break. My name is Yusuf. I'm with the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. And today we are going to be talking about energy aid and trade between the two regions. I'm going to give a 1-minute remark and then start and introduce our panelists and then start our conversation. So as in our first panel, we talked about migration, which is one of the key issues in the region between the two regions, if not the most important issue for particular countries in the region. But both regions share a lot more beyond migration or immigration or refugees, including but not limited to energy, trade, tourism, and brain drain and beyond. So there's a lot more to talk about and which we will be talking about today. Today I have with me Amir. He's from Stanford University. He's a visiting scholar at Stanford, and his research focuses on trade between Europe and North Africa, particularly Libya. We have Pier Paolo from IAI in Rome. He's a research fellow in Rome. His research focuses on energy, and particularly clean hydrocarbons. And last but not least, we have Dima joining us from Amman, Jordan. She is the founder and chair of Integrated International. It's a civil society organization based in Amman. And she will be talking about European aid in Jordan. So, Amir, I'm going to start with you today. Again, thank you so much for being here. If you don't mind, can you give us a brief overview of your project, what you did with regards to the trade between the two regions and focusing on Libya? What are some of the issues and what are your recommendations going forward? Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you to the Wilson Center for having me here and for putting together such a great program and broader conference. So my paper focuses on a relationship between or across the Mediterranean that I've been thinking about and writing about for over a decade now, and specifically that my specific interest and kind of research in this is driven by what I see or what I find to be the main motivators behind that relationship from the EU side, the key driver being the foundation of the EU itself, that initial pooling of resources to instill stability and peace, and then extrapolating that when it comes to matters of foreign policy. So very much the use of trade and the economic lever of power, or commercial relations to try and instill some stability, which have been so successful within the EU, and then extrapolating that beyond the EU's borders. In Libya itself, the EU has had such a strong commercial relationship since my paper focuses specifically since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, so from 2011 up until this year is the data that I look at and the developments that I explore. But even prior to that, EU's ties with Libya have been particularly strong, commercially speaking. And this is, as I say, this is driven by that EU goal, that EU desire to achieve peace, prosperity, and that is very much embedded in not just the treaties of the EU, but also the specific legislations and policies like the Common Foreign and Security Policy, the Common Defence and Security Policy, and the Common Commercial Policy as well. So what I found as I was exploring and thinking about this relationship between the EU and Libya was the kind of mismatch between the amount of trade flowing between the two countries and then what was happening on the ground. Specifically, I look at crises in Libya defined using a broad spectrum everywhere from political unrest and protests all the way to violent conflict and civil war. And of course, the involvement of external actors in that process. And importantly, an element which is often ignored, well, particularly from an EU policy mechanism perspective, but also when thinking about Libya as a state, the internal tribal and regional fidelities that exist, and more often than not, trump, to pardon the pun, any other kind of interest, political kind of agreement or peace and stability interest as well. And what I found in this time frame in particular was this constant, as I say, flow of goods and services between the two regions, and the important role that hydrocarbons, oil and gas, plays in this trade relationship, and indeed for the Libyan economy and Libya more broadly, Libya as a country more broadly. Hydrocarbons make up roughly 2/3 of the country's GDP and over 90% of its exports. So it very much highlights how important it is for the country, and that is linked to some of the policy recommendations that I can delve into a little bit later. From the EU perspective, these oil and gas goods make up the majority of its imports from Libya. Again, just over 2/3 of EU imports, so that has been fluctuating from peaks over 90% to around 70%, but the latest figures of EU imports from Libya being made up of oil and gas. And that is a consequence of Libya's position as the seventh largest, housing the seventh largest proven oil reserves, 21st largest gas reserve as well. And therefore, what this tells me as I think about this relationship, what this tells me is that there is very much an economic incentive there on both sides of the Mediterranean to achieve some form of stability, or at the very least to ameliorate crises in so much as possible. And so in the paper, I delved into why this policy, I call it the trade crisis policy, I delved into why it failed essentially in this time frame. Although there are signs of success, I'm not too pessimistic in the paper, I should add. One of the key reasons I found, and something that even we had discussions earlier this morning, one of the key reasons is the EU's broad brush kind of approach to the country, and not taking into account the specific context in which these policies and this trade is taking place. And what I mean by that is not accounting for that particular infrastructure, political infrastructure, societal infrastructure that exists in the country, that has been a consequence of the previous Muammar Gaddafi regime's policies and ways in which the country was run, which we can explore a little bit later, but also post-Gaddafi, the transitional governments, the two rival governments that have also come to the fore in the country, and in all but name a third rival government kind of supplanted with the UN support, UN sponsorship as well. And so what I found, the key reasons for this failure, I identify three key reasons. The first being economic mismanagement, and what I mean by that is how the economy has been managed post-Gaddafi, and particularly how the rents accrued from hydrocarbons, as well as other trade in resources, how the benefits of those rents, of those revenues, have not been distributed either in an even manner or in an equitable manner. And this has been made possible by the second key aspect, the political impasse that exists in the country. There were some signs of potential for success. The Libya political agreement that was signed between the two rival governments and introduced the third, all but a name, as I say, government into the country. But that hasn't led to, that was signed in 2015, that hasn't led to that political agreement lasting, or in other words, it hasn't led to that fall in crises and violent clashes and so forth. And this also leads to the third key point, the militarization of disputes, and specifically how the different actors have used the control or management of certain parts of the economy, production facilities of oil, for instance, used them as a bargaining chip, so halting production to force political concessions, which we've seen a number of instances where that has taken place, and indeed success in achieving those political concessions as well. And all these three main kind of reasons or drivers of that failure have been underpinned by migratory pressures of refugees finding themselves or making their way to Libya, either to find work in Libya itself or as a crossing point into Europe as well. I did also conduct a quantitative analysis where I introduced a couple of models to assess this relationship and perhaps I can talk a bit later on without.
Of course, thank you so much, Amir. I think I'm not as pessimistic as you mentioned. I think that energy trade, and Pierre will also talk about this to a certain degree, is one of the areas that both regions could potentially collaborate even more, especially in this context where energy is even a bigger issue with the war in Ukraine. But I'll get to Pierre in a second. Dima is joining us from Amman, Jordan. Thank you again, Dima. Her work is focused on aid in the region, especially Jordan, European aid in Jordan, focused on civil society. Dima, do you want to explain your project, what you worked on, what your policy solutions are? Would you mind? Thank you.
Sure, of course. First of all, thank you very much, Yusuf, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for the opportunity to take part in this important research, as well as in the conference today. My paper explores the effectiveness of the EU democracy promotion programming in Jordan with a focus on civil society support as part of a broader and challenging development aid dynamic in the country. I'm essentially arguing that the EU's geopolitical priorities and securitization agendas are dampening the EU's willingness to push for concrete political reforms in the country, opting instead to fund basic civic startup activities. And this is diluting the effectiveness of the EU's democracy promotion work, as well as limiting the potential role of civic action in Jordan. And of course, this we've known for a long time, but the war on Gaza is inviting a new reading of the democracy imperative in Jordan and the region, one that should now be viewed through a geopolitical lens. Jordan, of course, remains instrumental in the political landscape in the region and its security and future stability, but the cost of this ongoing democracy deficit is higher today. The current crisis in the Middle East has now accentuated the urgency of political and economic reforms in Jordan and brought to the fore the specter of extremism, divisive identity politics, and obviously Islamist threats. Now, to support my argument, I track the development of the European neighborhood policy, through which the EU has regulated and promoted its relations with the MENA for the last 2 decades. I'll just say a few words about this. Now, the Arab uprisings of 2011 prompted the EU to revise its overall approach to democracy promotion as part of the ENP. Revisions were meant to transcend this narrow and more procedural definition of citizenship and democracy. So not only the right to vote, but coupled with other civil and human rights. And democracy development was meant to be rewarded through positive conditionality coupled with a negative conditionality for democratic backsliding. But these divisions or revisions did not live up to their claims, and the procedural conception of democracy prevailed. And then with issues like migration and terrorism emerging, this concept of deeper democracy was buried, really, and the EU continued to push its security agenda, supporting national sectors to assist on counterterrorism and migration management while avoiding more substantive political reforms. And obviously, this process has now culminated with the relatively recent EU migration agreements with Tunisia and Egypt, Lebanon, Mauritania that Alyssa was talking about. And those clearly signal migration to have become this new pivot of the EU's cooperation with the MENA partners. I also take a look at the EU's democracy support for civil society as part of a broader dysfunctional aid dynamic in the country. We have around 7,000 civil society organizations in Jordan. They are undermined by a host of legal, administrative, and funding control mechanisms. Restrictions on funding are particularly damaging, and the government effectively determines what can and cannot be funded. Most civil society organization or most civil society aid in Jordan, including that from the EU, flows into 3 to 5 year programs. So the support is very much short term, and it goes to mostly soft civic activism with limited attention to the legal environment in which these organizations operate, as well as the structural hurdles that they face. And this dynamic has been well documented in literature. Usually to secure ongoing presence in developing countries, you have foreign organizations, avoiding friction with host governments by pursuing measurable and regime-compatible programs. And what I mean by measurable is usually these programs emphasize safe, quantitative outputs and outcomes, such as the number of women trained, the number of workshops held, or CSOs, the number of CSOs receiving grants. And then when it comes to grants to CSOs, those are usually restricted, with local organizations having to align their projects to donor priorities and funding cycles. And this has this has a host of results. Maybe the most important one is that this inhibits issue progress and the ability of the sector to move beyond small-scale activities such as the provision of welfare and relief services and basic advocacy in the form of awareness-raising dialogues and workshops and conferences. The third factor I consider is the current crisis in the region, as it raises the costs of delaying reforms. Obviously, the war on Gaza, obviously, it had a seismic impact on the region. In Jordan, it exacerbated already existing economic challenges. It also mobilized a broad protest movement and opposition to the peace treaty with Israel. And Jordanians' anger and opposition to the war is only growing. And obviously, anger could fester without a more open civic space and could turn inward or go underground. The youth in particular continue to have an instrumental role in leading the protest movement. This is important to note because, and Dr. Dione alluded to this earlier, youth in Jordan represent approximately 1/3 of the population. Unemployment amongst youth is around 50%. And the country's geographic and demographic proximity to Palestine has really ensured that the youth are politicized with strong pan-Arab and pan-Islamic sentiments. The war on Gaza also is providing fodder for the Muslim Brotherhood and its local political arm, the Islamic Action Front. In our latest parliamentary elections that took place on September 10th, the IAF support for the Palestinian cause allowed it to expand its influence beyond its traditional constituency. The party actually gained about 1/5 of the seats in parliament and won 5 times as many votes as the next party. Now, with Jordan gaining strategic weight and visibility through its enhanced security role in the war on Gaza, it is highly unlikely that democratic reform is going to be on the minds of donors. We have the recent decision by NATO to open a regional liaison office in Jordan. So that's another gauge of the West's prioritization of security. Now, the king's political dexterity has enabled him to contain the local scene effectively so far. But not all the shockwaves of the war have surfaced. And I'll just stop here as I cover the 3 main points in my paper.
Thank you, Dima. Thank you. I think those are very important points, especially in this context in the war in Palestine and in Lebanon, and its impact, especially on Jordan. So I'm going to turn to Pierre to talk about his work on energy, focusing on clean hydrocarbons and the trade of such material between the two regions. Pierre?
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Masha and the Wilson Center for organizing these events and project. My research, as you mentioned, is on energy cooperation between the two regions. I think that the two regions have experienced different stages, different phases of cooperation, frustration regarding energy. We see also in his paper the growth of hydrocarbon trade, especially from North Africa, given the geographical proximity, infrastructure, historical relations, while the Gulf is more overlooked from an energy perspective and energy cooperation up until 2 years ago. But I think that now, despite these phases, these ups and downs, we are at a crossroad for energy cooperation between the regions. Why? Because we see that there are international, domestic developments alongside technological and economic developments that put some constraints to future cooperation, but also provide new opportunities. And in this sense, I think that the global energy transition is certainly the most relevant factor that is shaping energy relations, not only between the EU and MENA regions, but for the European Union it's essential to envisage a new strategy, a new policy, a new vision for external energy policies that reconcile its domestic climate policy with foreign and external outreach. Because the European Union has embarked in its Green Deal that will transform its energy mix, energy consumption, but this will obviously have a repercussion on trade in other countries, especially the MENA countries, which we see that they are the largest hydrocarbon producer. And so geography matters. The MENA region is critical and crucial for the European Union. And so the European Union needs to have this vision. At the same time, the MENA countries are also undertaking measures regarding decarbonization in their own way. And although there are great emphasis, great ambition to have cooperation on renewables, my research focuses on molecules, because despite the growth and the rising relevance of electricity, stated also by the International Energy Agency, molecules will remain crucial. And so I focus on methane emissions and hydrogen. Methane emission is because Russia's war to Ukraine, the reconfiguration of energy flows, provided new inputs, new momentum for gas cooperation with the MENA countries, and gas-producing countries were more eager to help Europe. But at the same time, the trajectory of gas demand in Europe due to climate policy raised questions regarding new deals, the need of new deals in infrastructure. So by looking at methane emissions, European Union could reconcile its energy security objectives with its climate policies. And there are strong arguments, both in the environmental perspective, economics, and security, to look to this issue, not only for the European Union, but also for the MENA countries. MENA countries are experiencing all rising energy demand, energy consumption due to demographic growth, industrialization, energy subsidies. And so capturing those emissions, the methane emissions could increase market liquidity, could provide new volumes, not only for the European markets, but also for the internal markets. And then I look at the hydrogen sphere, because there is great interest, and there is the complementary nature between Europe that will be an importer, while MENA countries, all MENA countries, not only hydrocarbons, could become exporters of hydrogen. And so the idea is that there are arguments for cooperation, but there are massive challenges to actually deliver and create an international trade market of hydrogen. And so my policy recommendation focus on how to create dialogue and institutionalize different platforms for addressing these two issues, because regarding methane, we will need to have great cooperation regarding data, transparency, capacity building, and so on, while on hydrogen, we will need to have obviously contracts. So we need to encourage demand and ensure investments also in the MENA region. but also we need to have coordination regarding regulatory frameworks, certifications, and sustainability criteria, sustainable criteria regarding water use and so on. But I'm happy to delve later.
Of course,
Thanks.
of course. Thank you so much, Pierre. I want to turn to you, Amir, but you can also answer this question after Amir, because it's also your topics are related in terms of energy trade. So I wanted to ask both of you this question. So in your paper, you talk about how the trade impacts stability. You focus on Libya, but I wanted to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, the broader region. Do you think that trade, especially energy trade, with the ongoing war in Ukraine and how it impacted European energy markets and Middle Eastern energy markets as well, do you think that stability, yes, in Libya, but also in the region, could be positively impacted with more cooperation in terms of energy trade or trade in general? And Pierre, you can also, after Amir, pitch in too. Yeah.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thinking about it from a regional perspective, we'd have to be very careful when we think about energy trade, and it has to be dependent on the makeup of the respective economy. So for Libya, where hydrocarbons make up 2/3 of GDP, over 90% of exports, it makes sense to use hydrocarbons, energy trade, as a means to try and forge some form of stability, or at least incentivize stability is how I word it in my paper. That would look very different in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, where the makeup of the economy doesn't have that rentier nature that Libya does. In terms of how that can be done, or how that might be achieved, or have that positive, as you put it, that positive impact on stability or linked crises as well. I think leveraging it in a way, leveraging trade and hydrocarbon trade in a way that provides that incentive as much as possible. So rewarding political agreement, for instance, in the Libyan case. So whether that is something that might be written into a new trade agreement or part of negotiations for trade agreement, and then the way in which that is also monitored and implemented. And that monitoring and implementing side of things, and I think links quite nicely to the panel earlier as well, is making sure that there is not just a local or national buy-in, but also a regional and maybe international buy-in as well, whether to make sure that there is that transparency there, to make sure that the various stakeholders are part of that conversation, to make sure that stability or a peace agreement or a political agreement stays on track. And I think it's very important in that process, from an EU perspective, or indeed any other foreign actor, to avoid dictating what that agreement, that political agreement, that peace agreement looks like. Whenever that's happened in the past, it's very rarely led to successes, certainly not in Libya, certainly in other parts of the region as well. And therefore, I think paying specific attention to that part of the agreement, making sure there isn't kind of an imposition of a specific structure, political institution building that we may think of sitting here or in parts of Europe that might make sense or are kind of conventional in nature. They don't necessarily apply, or they aren't received in the same way as they would in other parts of the world. And I think that links back to my kind of underlying point about taking that local context into account when implementing these kind of policies.
Thank you, Amir. Pierre, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that regarding especially the evolution of the energy markets that we are seeing and we will see in the upcoming years, I think that the European Union should have in mind how to use this energy trade and also take into account the local needs. Because if you only focus on importing energy without taking into account all the consequent repercussion of this trade, this will not lead to stability. Obviously, there is not one single factor that creates stability, but the energy crisis and the new context and the global energy transition provides a new context where governments need to have in mind also the different needs, different objectives of their partners. And so energy can be certainly a way, but this need to be included in a broader perspective, in a broader and holistic approach.
Thank you, Pierre. Actually, I want to turn to Dima and tie these questions to Dima's specific research project, aid or democracy promotion aid in Jordan and in the region from Europe. So yes, Europe needs more of Middle Eastern energy, and that's not going to change, at least not in the short term. Do you think that that's going to impact how European Union works in terms of supporting civil society in Jordan or in the broader region? Do you think that Europe's needs will be reprioritized in terms of having more energy cooperation, more trade cooperation, which negatively could impact Europe's involvement in democracy or civil society promotion in Jordan or beyond?
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep my answer short here, but for sure, I mean, with these new agreements that have been signed on migration, and they have also as well energy components, of course, we're going to see, I mean, the EU still emphasizes democracy development as a main objective, but obviously we're going to see a lot of, this being put on the back burner for now. So yes, definitely it's going to suffer.
Of course. And to follow up with that question, I wanted to ask, yes, there's issues with democracy promotion or civil society promotion in Jordan from with regards to regulatory frameworks or support from the government. But is there enough public interest in European aid in Jordan in terms of civil society? Is there enough organizations? Is there enough interest from the public, especially with what's happening in Gaza? Because yes, there's more radicalization, more anger in Jordan and obviously in the region overall. But is the public really concerned with this in terms of? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I understand. Of course, that there is definitely still a lot of interest in EU aid and in donor aid in general. But at the same time, the war on Gaza has definitely affected the credibility and legitimacy of the EU within the country. International commitment to the rule of law, human rights, and the rules-based order is now widely regarded not only by Jordanians, but also by Arab citizens to have been undermined by what is regarded or perceived as the West's bias towards Israel. So a lot of CSOs in the country, and as I said, we have around 7,000, are expected to continue to apply for foreign funding from the EU and other donors. However, the ability of these organizations to serve as conduits for community empowerment, for social cohesion, for accountability, that's definitely expected to be undermined.
Thank you so much, Dima. I'm going to turn to Pierre to ask about a broader question about what strategies and policies would you recommend in terms of overcoming the challenges both Dima mentioned and Amir mentioned and you mentioned in terms of cooperation between the two regions and developing a more robust international hydrogen trade or energy trade and hydrogen trade as well, and especially within this context in a more tense and delicate moment in history.
Thank you. I think that it's essential again to grasp the evolution of the general landscape, and so in terms of hydrogen, for example, the European Union needs some imports to decarbonize its industry, heavy energy-intensive industry. But at the same time, we have a not very competitive market because we have very high prices. So again, the idea of creating win-win solution and to have a more reconciled foreign policy regarding climate and energy suggests that the European Union should provide and create trade and investment partnership with these countries in order to use hydrogen within the MENA countries. This will allow to have decarbonized products at lower cost, create industrial opportunities for the MENA countries, also for their young population. We heard this morning the relevance. And so creating this partnership through investments of technology and creating markets, regulation, that would be crucial to create a more cooperative framework and relations. And this is something that, for example, the European Union is something that is taking into consideration, also President von der Leyen. Again, we need to streamline the initiative, the ideas, the funds, and this will require also a great effort, political effort within the European Union.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm going to turn to Amir now. So we talked about international cooperation between the two regions in terms of trade, but do you think that potential cooperation between the two regions, whether it's hydrocarbons or other trade materials, would that potentially, yes, we talked about stability, but do you think that that could potentially impact the different factions within Libya in terms of bringing them together and kind of fostering not necessarily stability, but at least a conversation between those different factions, because that could in the future potentially be a framework for different countries that are in crises or that are experiencing different factions fighting with each other.
Thank you, Yusuf, for your question. An important question when considering a case study or an example like Libya, given the local makeup of tribal fidelities and regional alliances as well. When it comes to an external role in that process, what I've seen and looking at analysing the data is it doesn't have that much of a bearing on bringing the parties together. And I think that's because of the way it's rolled out. So rather than it being a source of cooperating or towards a communal aim, the economic development of the country, or to accrue as much oil and gas rents, for instance, it's been used or utilised more of it in a competing nature. So one regional government controlling hydrocarbon facilities at a certain point in time and limiting the production of the oil and gas to achieve political concessions. So used as a way to force political concessions. So in that sense, it's behaved more as a competing component rather than something bringing them together. That being said, I think it's important to have almost a reformulation or rethinking of what we're trying to achieve with this trade, and this linked to some of the spring meetings, the World Bank and IMF spring meetings. Some of the key takeaways from there as well is kind of thinking really hard or looking at the data and disentangling this relationship between economic development and stability or peace. There were plenty of examples that came out of those meetings where there was economic development, but not necessarily stability or peace, which I think tells us something about which way round these developments may take place, or maybe more precisely, depending on which context we're concerned with, it will be one way around, in another context it will be the other way around. So in the case of Libya, maybe we can achieve economic development, and what I mean by that is the equal distribution of the rents accrued from, say, hydrocarbons, the largest contributor to GDP. Maybe that needs to come before some form of political agreement, which makes it harder to incentivize from an EU perspective. But I think it also points to the increasingly kind of complex nature of conflict or instability, not just in Libya, but globally as well.
Thank you, Amir. I wanted to follow up with you, but I also want to ask Pierre and Dima the same question too. I wanted to link up this conversation to the previous one, migration. I know that's not our topic today, but part of the migration issue is brain drain, and that Middle Eastern countries, all of them experience this to a certain degree, including Libya, Jordan, Turkey, and all of them experience people leave, especially younger people who have a future, have a problem with being able to dream a better future for themselves and for family. They move to the West, to Europe, to the United States. So I wanted to ask three of you, do you think that part of this is, and you talked about economic development, both in Libya, without a political agreement, do you think that, I mean, to me at least, answers kind of very complicated, but because it's not just economic development, lack of economic development, that's forcing people to move to other countries. There's other components to the conversation. But do you think that Libya or beyond, or Jordan, Edema, do you think that these kind of deals, these kind of more economic cooperation, both in energy or in general trade, could kind of alleviate that issue of brain drain from the regional countries, from Jordan to Morocco to Turkey to all of the countries in the region? Do you think that could be potentially one of the many solutions or helpful to the issue of brain drain?
I mean, certainly providing access, specifically youth access to employment, would be a huge contributor to stability, or at least economic development. And in the case of Libya, I think this is where we see the interests and role of private companies and organizations playing having a negative impact on that trade and crisis relationship. Specifically, so for oil in Libya, the governance of the oil industry in Libya is governed by the 1955 petroleum law. It's only been amended a few times, and the latest meaningful one was in 1961, the year before Libya joined OPEC. So within that law, basically foreign companies, private companies come into the country, they can explore and produce oil, and they get, as it currently stands, an even share of royalties and rents from those hydrocarbons. So what that means is that industry is largely run by foreign actors, foreign businesses, and foreign employees as well. So then that puts the pressure then on employment within Libya for Libyans. So having a reform of important industries or sectors that have such a large part in the economy, I think is one of the key ways of unlocking this pressure, if you will.
Thank you. Pierre, do you want to share? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's the idea to create a more equitable and just partnership, not only trade, regarding the energy transition could certainly address the issue through technological cooperation, institutional, but also educational. Okay, so I think that here again we need to understand the needs and the objectives of each country and different peculiarities of each countries, and build this new energy cooperation. I look at the energy part, also to address other issues such as migration or stability or prosperity.
Thank you. And Dima, if you wanted to share.
Yeah, sure.
Of course.
Sure. No, I'll just start by saying that, just to emphasize what you said, but the Arab Barometer surveys have always shown that a large percentage of Jordanians as well as other Arab youth have expressed keen interest in migration, and obviously addressing unemployment, which is in Jordan a main problem and a main challenge. That's one solution, but that's not the only challenge that the youth are facing. Freedom of expression, there is a crackdown on political expression, there is a closing up of the civic space. So these are also all important push factors that should also be considered. I don't think that it's only about economic development and finding jobs for these youth.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to our audience for questions now, and including our online audience. You can There's a chat box in this webcast. You can use that to ask questions, if you will, for those who are watching us online. And yeah, if there's any online questions, I'm happy to take the online questions as well. But from the audience, if there are any, there's go. Yeah.
My question is about the use of resources. I'm an old man, and I remember seeing a statistic when I was in elementary school about how much energy this country, the United States, used. It was said that we were 5% of the world's population, and we're using 60% of the world's goods and resources. But it has changed. And so could you address that, please?
Address the change in that use, as in why it's taken place. I mean, it's a natural progression towards more industrialization of other nations, other states. I think an important part of that, particularly for emerging economies that are, or developing economies, or lesser economically developed countries across the Middle East and North Africa region, is the environmental pollution kind of aspects that come with that as well. And that, of course, isn't a conversation that is limited to the Middle East and North Africa, the US as well. Obviously, the carbonization of industry and the kind of impacts of that. I think it's a natural effect of companies across the world, countries across the world, increasing their kind of industrial capacity.
Do you want to add?
No, I just want to point out that, for example, the Gulf countries are some of the largest consuming energy countries per capita, for example. So for hydrocarbon producer, they are not only the largest hydrocarbon producer and exporters, but now they have become also some of the largest consuming countries. And so this is actually threaten the system, the energy, the economic system, which relies on hydrocarbon revenues. So this is why also for them, the decarbonization or the energy diversification is important.
Thank you. Dima, do you want to add anything?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience. If you can introduce yourself, that would be great too.
Hi, I'm Mary Claire Roach. I'm from the Air Barometer. So, Dima, I'm very happy to hear that the data's been helpful. The latest data, if anyone's interested, was just released 2 weeks ago, and it covers 8 countries from the last year. And we did ask a lot of questions on democracy and climate change and energy in that respect. So my question is about kind of the state of fossil fuels versus clean energy development in MENA. Generally, it's incredibly popular, we find, to phase out fossil fuels, to phase out polluting cars among citizens. So when there's suggestions of developing further negotiations or further agreements surrounding petrochemical or petrol fuels, is this not, setting up the country for kind of ideally really fading industry as the world, continues to experience climate change? Is investing more heavily in oil just really kind of passing the buck? And also, if we then become reliant on oil when the rest of the world is shifting to clean energy, it seems like is that not a short-term solution? Thank you.
Do you want to take a stab at it?
I can jump.
Of course, go ahead.
When thinking about trade, and specifically hydrocarbon trade between the EU and the MENA region, I think it's important to think of it from both the supply and demand side. So from an EU perspective, it craves and wants and demands increasing amounts of energy imports. And we've even seen that amidst the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and we've seen that in other contexts, whether it's whilst sanctions were being imposed on Iran for its nuclear program, we've seen how there has been that growing EU demand for those energy resources, for those hugely polluting and, as you say, hopefully dwindling forms of energy. So I think the conversation, rather than it being made on the kind of supply side and kind of discouraging, I mean, absolutely discouraging on the supply side, but there also needs to be on the demand side as well, seeking alternative fuels or sources of energy, rather than having that, as I say, increasing number or increasing demand for those resources.
I totally agree, and I would like to add that we need to have in mind that the energy transition will not be the end of fossil fuels entirely, and so there are some parts of the world, especially in Africa, Asia, where the energy demand is growing, and there will be the demand for fossil fuels. So the most relevant and the most pressing issue for MENA countries is how to position in a new context where energy demand, fossil fuels demand will, in a sense, decline, but will not disappear. And so here again, countries will need to expand environmental criteria for their production. This is why, for example, I addressed the issue of methane emissions, but not only. The idea is that fossil fuels will not go to zero, but there are needs to address the environmental aspects, how you produce, how you can reduce the carbon intensity of your production. And certain countries in the region are well positioned. For example, in the Gulf countries are well positioned, while, for example, North African countries are lagging behind on this. But yeah, again, the demand will remain. There will be shifts and transformation, but some share of energy supply will remain on fossil fuels.
Thank you. We have a few more questions from the audience. I think Merissa wanted to ask something first. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, guys, for this discussion. So I guess two questions. One, as we see the EU recalibrating its relationship with the GCC, primarily because of these energy needs, and as Ousmane Dione mentioned today, he had just returned from the summit in Brussels, the GCC EU summit. It seems that the rest of the region, is not necessarily part of that discussion. So it's now very much focused on the GCC because of basically the energy demand. But how can you ensure that part of that conversation also ensures that the non-oil producing countries are also benefiting from more long-term plans in a more comprehensive way, particularly given the challenges that they are facing? I mean, most of them are in the neighborhood of the wars that are taking place, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon. And that takes me to sort of a second part of the question that is more for Dima, which is, the GCC countries, obviously are not seeking EU funding for democracy. And their civil society organizations are very limited. And that's just not a conversation. So how does this new, EU GCC, togetherness on energy, how will that also impact any pull factor from Jordan, particularly from CSOs that are focused on democratization? Because that's not really a priority for the GCC.
Dima, do you want to start?
Can you just elaborate a bit on that question?
Yeah. Yeah. You can hear us, right, Dima?
Yeah, there's probably a delay.
Yes.
Okay.
So the GCC, the democratization is not a priority for the GCC. And you're saying that there are some organizations still in Jordan and other parts of the Middle East that are still working towards that. And yes, the EU will change its priorities in supporting democratization. But as this new GCC-EU relationship basically strengthens further on energy, you're going to see not only reprioritization on the EU side, but some pushback from the GCC as well. But how does this impact the work on the ground of the CSOs that are working towards more openness? Let's not call it democracy, let's call it more openness and more political reforms.
In Jordan?
Sure, let's focus on Jordan.
Okay. I mean, in Jordan, we're already feeling a dearth of or a reduction in funding for various reasons, whether that or the Ukraine or the war in Ukraine, and obviously that's going to be a price that we are going to pay because of decades of development support that has not really weaned these organizations or fostered any self-reliance. And the government doesn't provide funding for these organizations. And so their reliance, their dependency on foreign donors for support will continue to be a priority for them. We do see some movement with civil society organizations, some of them trying to transition into more social enterprises so that they can do social good and at the same time generate some income to cover their core costs, or even businesses with the social agenda. So we do we see some of that movement. And in that respect, there are wonderful foundations in Jordan and also in the region that are working on venture philanthropy. And those are, we see that their focus really is those social enterprises rather than the smaller NGOs that are working on human rights issues and civil liberties. Yani it's a risk. It's not something that we are super happy about. The dearth of resources is going to continue to be a challenge. I think the best thing is, in my head, there's a lot of opportunity for this localization, aid localization agenda that might be able, if we were able to operationalize it correctly, and if that localization agenda was able to invite all the actors, whether it's foreign donors, whether it's philanthropists, whether it's the government or other local actors, national and subnational, if those were all to come to one table and decide on an integrated development approach for Jordan, and then different donors can pool funding, and we can sequence funding in a way to create value. I think that there is a lot of opportunity there. But until that happens, yes, we will continue to suffer from the dearth of resources that are being channeled elsewhere.
Thank you, Dima. Do you want to answer Merissa's first part of the question? Yeah,
if I understand the question correctly, and that is how can non-GCC Middle East and North African states be part of this new EU-GCC process? I mean, I think it would depend heavily upon what's within the scope of this EU-GCC process. If it does include an aspect of more regional integration of either the various industry or the rents that are accrued from these industries, that would be of making sure that they are incorporated. Or maybe it might just be part of a set of regional policies. Maybe the EU sets up another regional policy with countries across the region that target specifically employment or youth employment, something that isn't necessarily a problem for the GCC, or hardly a problem for the GCC countries, we can say. So maybe having a more bespoke agreements based on the economic needs of the GCC, and then the non-GCC states of the region would be a way of kind of bringing it together.
Pierre?
Yeah, I would suggest that we do not create more fragment policies and more fragment approach to the region. And so we see that the European Union, for example, has a new agenda for the Mediterranean in 2021, now has the strategic partnership with the Gulf. I think that the region and the regional cooperation would benefit from a more regional approach, a regional policy framework that at the same time acknowledge the country specific. And in this sense, for example, non-exporting countries, non-hydrocarbon exporting countries could be part of this cooperative framework, and hydrogen, for example, is one of the area again because you need renewables. You do not need necessarily gas, but you need renewables, and so they are they could become part of this framework from the European side. But it's important to have a more regional approach with acknowledging the country specific.
Thank you, Pierre. And with your answer, we are coming to an end for our conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you, Dima, for joining us from Oman. I want to invite Merissa for closing remarks.
Thank you, Youssef. And once again, thank you for all those who attended online, but also in person. So we thought we would just close this by summarizing a few key points that emerged throughout the day, and from our keynote speaker, Dr. Dione. He, I think, highlighted very eloquently MENA's economic progress as being crucial for Europe. As 20% of MENA's trade is with Europe and the Mediterranean, we should, at least he recommended, that we look at it as a bridge rather than a barrier. But of course, also emphasized the importance of basically peace and stability for development to take place. And then the second point that was very important with regards to the rapid growth of the labor market in MENA and the demographic challenge that the region will be facing. It's crucial that this is part of the conversation with Europe and is something that will benefit not only Euro-MENA relations, but also engagement of the United States with the region. And I want to highlight again how he emphasized the importance of not only political reforms, but the political will for a lot of these reforms to take place. From the first panel, a few points on migration. Thousands of people migrate from the MENA region to Europe for better opportunities, given the challenges, particularly when it comes to conflict or the economy. And there's a clear erosion of trust between both regions, which will hinder the ability to secure deals in the future. So the trust building is important as part of any future framework. The polarization of opinions on migration is a significant challenge. We hear a lot more about migrants, linkages to security threats and crime rather than their contribution to the economy. And finally, the importance of cross-Mediterranean cooperation on migration, which again is something that will not only benefit both regions, but will also benefit the United States national security interests in both regions. And from this panel, linking both trade and energy deals to peace building and political development to foster stability, trade and investment partnerships. The EU is still emphasizing democracy, but there is, of course, a reprioritization given the conflicts in the region today. So a lot of this, as Dima mentioned, is currently on the back burner, and it will impact those who are working for a lot of these causes. particularly political openings and political reforms. And finally, there's a lot of interest in the EU and donor aid, but the war has affected the war in Gaza in particular has affected the credibility of the EU, and we see a similar trend, of course, impacting the United States. So once again, I want to thank all of you for attending today, for your support, for the questions and comments, and most importantly, I want to really lift up both Yusuf and Masha, who did a lot of work to make this happen. It was a pleasure for the Middle East program to work closely with Global Europe, and thank you, Robin Quinville, for this collaboration, and thanks to all the scholars for the excellent work, and we hope to continue this conversation. This is only the beginning of the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.